Hi, everyone. Am I at all on camera? I'm gonna stand really close. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first day of the spring 2022 Royce final presentations. We have 4 speakers who are going to talk today about their research projects. For those who don't know, the Royce Fellowship was established in 1996 thanks to Charles Royce, class of 61. And it supports undergraduate students who conduct engaged, independent research projects of their own design across the United States and around the world. We have 25 fellows this summer, I want to say. And we'll hear from 4 of them today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting engaged research and undergraduate students. We will have 4 presentations and then we'll have a Q&A after that. So please hold your questions until after all the presentations are done. We're going to start with Connor Jenkins. Connor, take it away.
Hi, Jesus. Thank you for the really kind and generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's exciting to see you all. So hi, everyone. I'm Connor. I am a senior. I'm doubling in history and Africana studies, but my final thesis is in history. While I figure out how to share my screen, I do want to start with a few acknowledgements. If I can get my computer to work. Okay, this should work. I believe. Okay. Is this working? I'm hoping. Okay, great. So I'm Connor. I do want to mention a few people without whom this project would simply have not been possible. First, to Chuck Royce for his generosity that's really made such a rich interdisciplinary cohort possible. Second, to the other Royce Fellows for really modeling such a generous scholarly community that's demonstrating the very relations necessary for accountable and engaged scholarship. To Jesus and Maggie, who provided the support, space, and guidance that's allowed this project to develop. Francoise Hamlin, my advisor, is the pinnacle of scholarly integrity and mentorship. And I have no doubt that this project would not be without her enduring belief in my ability to pursue it. Finally, there aren't really the words to adequately thank my family who are here today. So all I can simply say is thank you. So, next slide. Okay. So on spring nights in 1835, Harriet Jacobs would steal away into the woods under cover of night, later writing that fear gave speed to her steps. Avoiding slave patrols on horseback, hallowing and shouting from a night of revelry and terrorizing enslaved people in the vicinity, she traveled 12 miles round trip by foot to town to see her children. She was going to see her children after Dr. James Norcom, the man who enslaved her, separated her from her children in retaliation for refusing to consent to his sexual advances. After she spent 7 years hiding in an attic before fleeing north, Harriet Jacobs later wrote perhaps the most canonical text documenting the experiences of enslaved women in the United States and became a major abolitionist activist in the North through the end of the Civil War. So I grew up in Southern Pines, North Carolina, and growing up in North Carolina, I always learned about slavery as an institution that was really only relegated to the Deep South and sort of the Mississippi Valley. And sort of at Brown, and also in reading Harriet Jacobs, her text, which is titled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, this misconception for me really collided with the reality that slavery permeated antebellum life in my home state as well. So Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery in Edenton, North Carolina, and her experience and narrative both reflected the central role of spatial discipline and control, as well as gendered violence in the institution of Atlantic racial slavery. The confluence of my own experience of memory, and more particularly forgetting of racial slavery in North Carolina, and the gendered and spatialized function of enslavement in Edenton has led me to my Royce project, in which I'm looking at the implications of space and gender and memory in slavery in Edenton, as well as the larger region of Northeastern North Carolina, as particularly instructive on regional difference in slavery and its afterlives, as well as its different meanings of freedom. So a capital in colonial North Carolina and a crucial hub for trade well into the 19th century, Edenton was the hometown of numerous early North Carolina politicians, including signatories of the Declaration of Independence. As a colonial capital, it also sustained early connections to the nation-building project that married racial slavery to settler colonialism. And so even as the nucleus of American racial slavery shifted southward towards the Mississippi Valley into the 19th century, Edenton still retained a sort of cosmopolitan cachet through networks of white affluence and political power that really traced their roots to the nation's founding. So one of the town's wealthiest and most prolific residents was James Cathcart Johnston, who's pictured here. Johnston was the son of a wealthy enslaver, Samuel Johnston, and his father had served as both a US senator and a North Carolina governor. And Johnston, James Cathcart specifically, lived in Edenton until he died in May of 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. By 1860, we know from census records that he enslaved at least 555 Black people across his multiple Eastern North Carolina plantations. And he was amongst the wealthiest enslavers in North Carolina and in the Upper South. So this is an image of his sort of crown jewel plantation that he loved to live on and that he was most proud of. So he owned multiple plantations across the region that I'm studying, which is Northeastern North Carolina. But this is the sort of crown jewel that is located just south of the central hub of Edenton. So it was on Hayes that he himself spent most of his time directly managing the enslaved people whose coerced labor produced the corn, the cotton, and the wheat that sustained his opulent wealth and life. He never married, but he did, and this only came out from research in the past few years, father 4 children with an enslaved woman named Edith Wood, whom he actually purchased from a family friend to whom he later bequeathed his entire estate and whose descendants occupy Hayes today. In the 1830s, he legally manumitted Edith and their 2 daughters who did survive into adulthood, and they resettled into Philadelphia in the 1830s. But an 1866 letter from his daughter Annie Wood Webb to the executor of his estate after his death indicates that he didn't even include his daughter in his will. So a central logic of racial slavery that Stephanie Camp, a scholar in slavery studies, probably best articulates through the bondage of space and time, really describes the spatial distribution of enslaved people's bodies and labors. I'm specifically using this lens to examine the power of gender and space in Edenton, contesting the idea that slavery in the Upper South was lenient in any way. In examining the gendered experience of space in Edenton and in Northeastern North Carolina, I discover a really important caveat, that the opportunities for escape and freedom were substantially different in Edenton than in the Mississippi Valley and in the Lower South, particularly through enslaved people's knowledge of nearby waterways and maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp. So this is an image of the Dismal Swamp Canal, which was built specifically by enslaved people. It's a little bit tough to see, but right here where my mouse is, this is where the actual canal is that goes through the Great Dismal Swamp, which now is 10% of the size it was at the turn of the 19th century. And at the time, it really extended all the way down from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way down here to the Albemarle Sound, where Edenton is circled right here. And I've zoomed in on this image of Edenton in 1867, because it says actually right here, Johnston's Fishery. So you see the really outsized role that Johnston played in the economy and the political economy as well of North Carolina at the time. Even after his death, it's still called Johnston's Fishery. So a capital in colonial North Carolina, it really sustained a lot of attention and travelers and connections that sort of expanded from just the sort of white affluence that enslaved a lot of people in the area, but also allowed for connections between enslaved communities and created opportunities for escape. And I say this specifically because the sort of caveat that I just shared about the possibility of escape being substantially different in this region is not reflective of any sort of investment by white enslavers in Black freedom, but it's really only reflective of the material difference in the landscape and the geography in the Upper South, and the ways in which enslaved people drew upon those geographies. So before and during the Civil War, enslaved people would flee eastward towards Edenton and towards the coast because it had a lot of maritime routes to the north through the Maritime Underground Railroad. And this is an image of Edenton Bay in town when I visited. And this is one of the many sites along the Albemarle Sound where ships would come and go and where enslaved people could easily, not easily, but would often steal away onto these ships for purposes of escape. And because enslaved Black people were central to the booming fisheries and to the maritime industries that sustained the region, these enslaved people, particularly men, were able to stow away fugitives heading north. And this is the same pathway that Harriet Jacobs took northward in 1842. So a nearby Civil War contraband camp was actually a site of refuge for fugitive enslaved people during the Civil War. But then in 1864, Confederate forces recaptured the fort and indiscriminately murdered Black soldiers and civilians. Still, even with this historical reality, the town valorizes the Confederate soldiers. I've reproduced the language because it's a little bit tough to read on this Confederate monument that's at the exact center of town. And this also is the site of the former market house, which is the sort of center of commerce in town and also where enslaved people would be sold and bought. So still the town valorizes these Confederate soldiers as really honorable, and spatial discipline as a fundamental tenet of racial slavery and the devaluation of Black life is particularly informing the local memory of slavery and the bloody crucible through which it ended in the Civil War. Descendants of enslavers occupy most of the plantations on which Black people labored, inviting tourists into their homes for holiday house tours to look at the architecture while erasing the violence of slavery that physically built these homes and sustained their occupants as well as their descendants today. So something my advisor, Professor Hamlin, always asks me is, why does this matter? Why should I care about history? So, sorry, wrong slide. So we're seeing really on a national level, the wars over memory and the meaning of the past play out at school board meetings and on TV pundits shows and talk shows on the radio. And I think that the deeply anti-Black responses to the groundbreaking cultural, political, and social work that something like the 1619 Project, along with ongoing attempts to ban books like, on this slide, Toni Morrison's epic Beloved, I think these make really crystal clear the contested and critical role that the stories we tell about the past and how this relates to structural violence, injustice, and white supremacy today is really critical, and how we also think on a scale of national versus local histories of how do we reckon with this. So often these discourses really fail to materialize in local contexts. Interrogating small towns and regions' investments in racial slavery isn't something that happens a lot. So by bringing a lens of racial slavery through space and gender to Edenton, I'm specifically arguing that the gendered and spatialized aspects of racial slavery worked and continue to work today to racialize the stories we tell about the past and how we commemorate it. In that vein, I want to close with what I think is a fairly deeply emblematic and stunning juxtaposition of the racialization of memory. So on this slide are some images of Hayes Plantation today, which the North Carolina General Assembly, as of last month, or 2 months ago now, is planning to purchase from the descendants of the beneficiaries of enslaved labor who were bequeathed the estate by James Cathcart Johnston, the Wood family, in 1865. The state is planning to purchase the plantation from them for $6 million. And today, Edenton is a majority Black town. So this investment of tax dollars from a majority Black town into preserving the homes of enslavers, to me, distills quite poignantly the potency of the misremembering of slavery and its impact on the small towns of the Upper South. On the other hand, this is the home of a formerly enslaved architect who actually played a pivotal role in creating a prosperous Black community in Edenton after the Civil War. And so the man who built this and many of the other homes on this block in Edenton for Black families and friends was himself enslaved on Hayes Plantation and physically labored to build the famed home the state is not purchasing. And yet this home, the one that sustained Black life and freedom after slavery, lies in disrepair. Finally, this is the site of which Harriet Jacobs hid in an attic of her grandmother's house for 7 years, specifically this location of the parking lot. This is where her grandmother's house used to stand. In an attic where she insisted upon freedom for herself and a better life for her children, even when she didn't even have the space to stand upright. And yet, there's no recognition of her courageous demands to life in the wake of its violent negation. In this moment today, we're doomed to fail to dismantle the legacies of slavery if we, particularly white Americans, are unable to interrogate our own intimate family and small town histories. I'm grateful for the richly interdisciplinary cohort and friends and the Royce Fellowship who really modeled, I think, the courage to look at the past with a critical eye and to pursue these histories with an accountable process of method and what the scholarship means for the future. So thank you all.
Great, thanks so much, Connor. Next, we have Ali Martínez who will present her project as well. Ali, I think if you use this, if you speak from here, it'll be
fun. Okay. And may I share my screen?
yes.
Okay.
You're trying to see your notes?
Yeah, I think so.
If you, the slideshow next to that,
How do I?
the little caret next to slideshow,
Oh, okay.
should have presenter mode.
Awesome. Is this okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, hello, my name is Alexandra Ali Martínez. I am a senior studying international public affairs and Latin American and Caribbean studies. And today I am presenting my Royce presentation, my Royce project, which is connected to my honors thesis, but today I'm solely focusing on my project. So I'd like to start with just a little background on myself and the development of this project. I was born and raised at the US-Mexico borderlands. My family is from Calexico, California, and Chula Vista, or San Diego, California. And over the past years, I've been working at a variety of binational nonprofit organizations in my community, including, as you can see here, recently as legal administrative assistant, working alongside binational legal service organizations, providing free immigration and asylum legal representation. I am also a teacher and director of the Children Adult Border Rights Educational Curriculum that is connected to one of these organizations. And I am also a community engaged scholar through amazing fellowships like the Swear Center's Arthur Lineman Public Interest Fellowship, and most importantly, the Royce Fellowship, which we are gathered for here today. But most importantly, I am an advocate community member. I'm a daughter and I am a sister. And here I share with you all some pieces of my heart. I grew up working alongside my grandmother, my mom, and my aunt in Eswatini, Calexico, California. And my parental grandparents, mi Nana Paz and mi abuelo Roberto, alongside my father, worked in California's agricultural fields from Calexico to Fresno. So they worked in cotton, lettuce, and grape harvest. Calexico is a part of the Imperial Valley, and it is the US's major source of vegetable and fruit. So that is a little bit about me. For Brown students interested in the Royce Fellowship next year, here is a definition of engaged scholarship. I moved through all the roles that I had mentioned previously through engaged scholarship, a combination of community-based knowledge that shifts the positionality of community members and groups to knowledge producers and partners in problem solving. So just to give a little community context about my Royce project, my Royce project took place in Tijuana, Mexico. At the US-Mexico border, currently migrants do not have the opportunity to present their asylum claims. In January 2019, the migrant protection protocols were implemented at the San Diego-Tijuana Port of Entry before extending across the rest of the border. Under the Migrant Protection Protocols program, migrants have to wait for their asylum hearings in the United States immigration courts in Mexico cities across the border. In total, there are 70,000 migrants who have been expelled to wait in Mexico. And this US immigration policy has created a vast humanitarian crisis across the border by intentionally stranding migrants in many border towns without access to housing, food, education, work, medical care, legal support, water, and even restroom access. Since migrants are forced to wait in Mexico, many struggle to find a lawyer to represent them in the United States, and less than 1% receive asylum approval under this program. In March 2020, in addition to the Migrant Protection Protocols, the 1944 Public Health Statute, Title 42 of the Public Health Safety Act, allowed governments to block non-citizens from entering the United States to preserve public health. Implementing Title 42 further limited migrants' access to the asylum process by rapidly returning migrants without access to officials. According to statistics from March 2021, more than 500,000 migrants have been expelled after encounters at the border, and these expulsions sent migrants directly back to the countries they were fleeing, unless they were from Central America and Mexico, in which they were returned directly to Mexico. So we talked a little bit about the community context and also my personal context. Putting those both together is the creation of this project. So in the spring and summer of 2020, I interned at a binational legal service organization through the Arthur Lyman Fellowship here at Brown. I worked at an organization that focuses on serving refugee children and families encountering the asylum process at the border. And after extensive conversation with children and their families, many expressed concerns about not having access to educational opportunities while awaiting their court proceedings. So to address these concerns, I created a child's educational curriculum for children who are in shelters and refugee camps while waiting in Mexico. The curriculum was created with the guidance and revision of migrant families, migrant children, nonprofit lawyers, and accredited representatives, university professors, international organizations, and shelter psychologists. Specifically, the children's curriculum explains the asylum process and empowers them to share their voices through creative outlets. This is a multilingual curriculum in Spanish, French, and English, and it is structured based on two main goals. The first goal is to answer many questions children migrants have about the asylum process. And the second is to allow the children to process their experiences through creative outlets. And so this includes an emphasis on narrative and storytelling, which allows children to build important skills that are also necessary while applying for asylum. There are 4 key units: I am, I have a right to, I am experiencing, and I will. And each unit has key organizing questions children often pose that frame the creative activities in each unit, including photography, film, letters, crafts, and drawings. The program days are divided into 3 key parts. So the children first receive an interactive lesson on narrative sharing or the human rights and asylum process. And then the children have time allotted for a specific drawing prompt for the day, followed by a theme unit creative activity, which varies from day to day. So I had the curriculum through the Arthur Lyman, but I needed to figure out a way to implement it. And that's when the Royce project came into the picture. The timeline and the process for the Royce project occurred at the largest migrant shelter of 17 shelters in Tijuana, Mexico, which is also the busiest border crossing in the world. Located in Tijuana's west side, the shelter houses nearly 190 migrant families, including 130 migrant children waiting for their asylum process due to the policies we spoke about previously. And one of the very unique qualities of this shelter is they have classrooms for all children in an open area adjacent to the shelter. So my honors thesis is also connected to the Royce Fellowship. And so I'm here specifically focusing on drawing prompts in the photoethnography project, which will be used to answer my research questions. For the drawing prompts, examples of daily prompts include share a memory of your migratory experience. Where do you feel protected? Share a time you felt happy, sad, worried, or excited. If you had a magic genie, what would you ask them? When I am older, I would love to be, draw a memory, draw a self-portrait. How do you envision the US? What has your experience been like in Mexico? And what has been the most difficult part of migrating? All these questions are purposely very open-ended to allow for a variety of response. There is also a photo ethnography project that invites the children to share their daily lives at the shelter. I mostly did my project over the summer, but I also returned this winter. I decided that I wanted to contextualize the children's creative projects. So I held 50-hour-long conversations with migrant parents and their children at the shelter. These conversations were open-ended and did not include a series of research questions, to also allow it just to be a very safe space to process experiences alongside creating connection with the community. So on the very academic side, these are my research questions. My research is focused specifically on two categories: immigration policies and discourse, and how immigration policies and discourse shape migrant children's experiences at the US-Mexico border. I then have subcategories of questions that focus on those two categories. But overall, I will be employing visual methodologies to explore the children's experiences with immigration policies and discourse by analyzing the drawings and photographs produced during the educational curriculum. I'm working on the central findings for my empirical chapters this semester. And so you can all attend my presentation towards the end of the semester if you would like to listen into that as well. Overall, I just want to say thank you to the Royce Fellowship, particularly Maggie and Jesus, for supporting us not only for the Royce Fellowship, but also beyond. My community partner, my amazing Royce advisor and second reader, Professor Evelyn Hudahart, and also my primary thesis advisor, Professor Yeva Jacinto. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. Next, we have Ren, who will present.
Yes, hello. Sorry that took a second to set up. Yeah, I am in a much better mood than when I joined this call. It's really wonderful to hear like the culmination of people's work, like especially, well, Ali and Connor so far, but really looking forward to the rest of these presentations as well. Yeah, so hi, my name is Ren Liu. I am a junior studying ethnic studies and science, technology, and society, and I'll be talking about my project from the Royce Fellowship this past year called Unraveled DNA, Tangled Identity, Racial Essentialism in Science and Medicine. So just for some context for like a very pertinent way this has come up on June 2nd of 2020, Anne Wojcicki, who's the CEO and co-founder of 23andMe, issued a statement on Black Lives Matter in a series of corporate responses to calls for racial justice and calls for abolition. And she notes that 23andMe is complicit in racism, in white supremacy, et cetera, and says that in order to address this and in order to address her company's complicity, the solution would be instead to increase diversity in the field of genomics and looking for more samples from people of color, from Indigenous people, and like specifically from Black people in terms of the response to BLM. However, this does nothing at all in terms of addressing the real ways that 23andMe perpetuates racism and maintains racial hierarchies that exist. And I'm going to get to that with the exact issues, which is that 23andMe, is a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company, which means that when you receive a test result back, what you get is this sense of your ancestry that's this percentage from this place or this percentage from that place. And it reasserts race as something that could be found biologically or could be found in a test tube. So I became really unsettled by this when I first heard about it and when it first started happening, because it's sort of become this cultural phenomenon of it being gifted for birthdays or for Christmases. And so how direct-to-consumer genetic testing constricts racial identity is that it is found in a test tube, that it's found somehow in your genome. And you have something that looks like this map here of saying that you're this % American or this % West African or this % Asian or European, etc. And this, at least in context and comparison to my own racial identity as an ethnic studies concentrator. So I'm Asian American, and that is something that I hold as a really strong racial and political identity. And it's not something that I came to until doing, specifically finding community within that, right? And also facing sort of like racialized violence or doing organizing work that makes that a point of pride. It has nothing to do with any kind of DNA test that I've taken, nor have I ever taken a DNA test. And this is often the experience of many other people who are racialized or identify as people of color. So what I wanted to look at with my project then is like, why did this unsettle me so much and why is it so dangerous? And it felt extremely urgent to me starting from my freshman year when many people I knew were asserting racial identities that they had never asserted or identified with in the past. Okay, so the driving question then of my project was, how does direct-to-consumer genetic testing, specifically through the inclusion of race and ancestry in its results, that represent a dangerous continuation of the belief that race is somehow biological? And how does that belief, which is inherently eugenicist and drove a lot of the eugenics movement in the 20th century, maintain and exacerbate the ideologies and material conditions of existing colonial white supremacist racial hierarchy? So lots of words, right? And like, what I mean by all of that is that understanding race as part of genetic testing requires understanding, so it seems very fun, right? And what I am doing is sort of examining why that might be a major issue and why it might be this continuation of these really, really dangerous histories of race science and eugenics, as well as disease scapegoating. So the guiding questions that came from this question were around, so I looked at my project in a threefold. So these are the guiding questions, and I'm going to go into a little bit like the three aspects that I took in addressing this driving question. So I looked at how science, tech, and medicine have been used as a technology of racialization to construct and maintain racial hierarchies throughout history. So this happens, I looked at periods of chattel slavery, colonization and genocide, border policies, eugenics, and disease scapegoating, which means specifically blaming disease on a certain racial group, which we see a lot with the construction of the border. And this pulled from a lot of my ethnic studies coursework. And then the next thing that I looked at was, so we've taken the history context, but how is this technology in terms of the ways that we actually view it, how does that have racist and colonial ideologies that inform that and contextualize that? And this pulls a lot from my STS background. And then finally, what are the major implications, right? So what of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing on what Dorothy Roberts, who's the author of Fatal Invention, what she calls the new biopolitics. What is the new biopolitics? How does this affect how we surveil bodies, on race-based medicine, on health policies, on native sovereignty, and immigration? So in terms of the methodologies I used, they were also threefold. So I did historical text-based research on racialization, disease, and genomics. And these are just some of the books that really, really have informed my understanding of this topic and research project. And then I did a deep dive into the actual science and technologies of DTC genetic testing in terms of how does this work? How do they figure out what percentage of a certain geographic location you might be from? And then finally, something that Kim Tallbear talks a lot about is that Kim Tallbear, who's a really incredible Native scholar who does work specifically on Native American DNA, she talks about how this work is really depressing, right? And how with doing research, we often look at the ways that these things disempower us. And what I wanted to know about was, this is a really dangerous continuation of how science continues to racialize and does all of these really messed up things, but how also is the tide shifting? How are people of color who have these very differing definitions of their own racial identity and how they identify navigating the ways that race is talked about in their fields? And how are they making, how are they using that and using their own lived experiences to create healthcare, to create systems that lead to better communities and more equitable ones? So some findings and key takeaways that I really wanted to share from these three folds of the research were that race as biology is, it's not a biological category that is politically charged. It is instead a political category that has been disguised as a biological one. And what I mean by that is that race was never biological. It became constructed as biological, and we began to look for it in biology in order to justify political or economic goals that were rooted in colonization and slavery. And then next, I feel it is really important to note that racial essentialism, which means the belief that race is somehow essential or inherent to a person's biology, has its roots in racial capitalism. And that started with chattel slavery in the US, and also predominantly came up also moreover when the coolie labor was sought from Asia and the Caribbean. And then eugenics and disease scapegoating in the 20th century was extremely effective in terms of how we think about race being associated with disease and with biology and with genetics now. And that we look at that with Chinese and Latinx exclusion at the border, and moreover, like looking at specifically how different diseases were racialized throughout the 20th century. Next, going into a little bit more of the actual technology side of things, the Human Genome Project, which was at the sort of turn of the century, proved that there was no genetic basis for race. And this is really important because with no genetic basis for race, all of these, all of the markers and the chromosomes in the genome that we say are part of racial identity or lead to this type of geographic ancestry were completely looked for and are therefore politicized. They are not, there was no, essentially there was no scientific basis for them until that was looked for by scientists and scholars. Next, ancestry is found through extremely politicized and political processes of AIMs, which are ancestry informative markers. So these are the genes and markers that genetic testing companies use to indicate whether you are one race or another. And in order to construct these, and which is what the companies pull from, studies sought to discover natural groupings of human beings. But those studies are only as natural and informative as the populations they sample. And another key finding was that there were extremely significant numbers of like European or people who were racialized as white as population samples, but the samples of specifically like Native and Indigenous populations to Turtle Island, as well as those racialized as Black, was very, very small. So those samples are a lot more unreliable. And the other issue with these ancestry informative markers is that they're not actually ancestral. We have no way of accessing the DNA of someone who lived, say, in Germany over like thousands of years ago. So when you get something that says you're this percentage European, that's saying that there's that percentage of a chance that your DNA might match someone who currently lives in Europe. And you also have no way of knowing what sample population that was from. And this also perpetuates the myth within science that there's some sort of racial or geographic purity, and it completely neglects the fact that there's been extreme global migration since our ancestral times. And finally, there's extremely dangerous implications of this on assertions over Native identity and Native sovereignty in the US and places like Canada. Race-based medicine leads to unequal healthcare and furthers racial disparities in healthcare and is also extremely disabling. DNA tracking in surveillance means that there's not only surveillance over the body, but over the genome, which means that before with how we use fingerprinting to incarcerate, this means that now having the DNA of one person gives you access to that entire person's family and whoever else might have that DNA. So it's really scary stuff. And so now I want to move it into a little bit more of joy and honestly what kept me going throughout this project, which was the oral histories that I conducted with undergrads, med students, and healthcare providers and scientists who either identified as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, who were either doing organizing work or doing work specifically addressing racial health disparities. These are some key takeaways from my interviews with them. And the reason why I call them oral histories was because these were oral histories of how these people came to identify racially and find their own community, and how that differs from the ways that race is imposed on them in their field or in their passion. So undergrads often noted that there was a rare mention of race at all. And if it was mentioned, it was seen as a special interest or a side project or distracting from their curriculum. Med students noted that there was strong organizing on curriculum changes. Many spoke about barriers to med school for people of color that were also extremely class-based, and noted that a lot of their political consciousness around race and entering into organizing work starts with becoming racialized upon entering med school in terms of the ways that disease is taught. And actually the exams that med students go through in their first year specifically ask you to identify disease, specifically ask you to identify a racial demographic based on a disease that is presented on the test, which I thought was absolutely abhorrent in terms of the existence of that on the test and how students were prepared for that. Providers made an extreme emphasis on the labor distribution of who it is up to not perpetuate these really racist and colonial ideologies of eugenics and disease scapegoating on patients, specifically patients of color. And they made sure that patients were treated with care, and also found a lot of and their solidarity with each other came more from national and larger scale organizations. And what came out of these interviews has become something that isn't really for my own personal research, but is in terms of just documentation, because as someone who's done organizing in the context of an institution where there's a high turnover rate as students, organizing often means reinventing the wheel constantly. So what I did with a lot of these interviews and these takeaways was created a timeline of organizing at Warren Alpert Medical School, which is the med school at Brown here, and created this basically and connected a lot of my interviewees with each other in terms of providing them with a network of people who were thinking about these things, because another thing that they all noted was that this was an extremely isolating experience or a tokenizing one. And moving forward, something that I feel really hopeful about is that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are constantly infusing their own experiences and passions into creating more equitable relational modes of healthcare and science. And this is going to continue happening, and I think it really needs to be documented. But the other things that I am continuing to think about now that this project is coming to a close is, what does it mean to support the work and complicated existence of BIPOC people who understand the interwovenness of race and science and medicine? What are the implications of the new biopolitic on the prison industrial complex, sovereignty, immigration, and healthcare? I work for a radio station called Prison Radio that specifically publishes commentaries from political prisoners and those incarcerated, and I'm thinking a lot about what have corresponded with a lot of our commentators on what this means for them specifically, and I'm hoping to think more about that. And then finally, I'm thinking a lot about where disability and reproductive justice can be further understood, because there isn't a lot of work published out there on this, and something that if you look at histories of eugenics is that they really focus on bodies gendered as female as bodies to target to not continue lineages of a certain unfavorable race. And acknowledgements, thank you so much to my professor, Lundy Braun, Eric Jones, Nicole Sintetis, who was a PhD student who my freshman year introduced me to a lot of these concepts and really encouraged me to kind of delve into what I thought were conspiracy theories of my own at the time. Angela Zhang, who runs the podcast Not Built for Us and is an alum of Warren Alpert. All my interviewees, specifically those from Code Black RI, which is a collective of providers of color and doctors of color who are working against health disparities, the Decolonization at Brown STEM Task Force, Royce cohort, Jesus and Maggie, thank you so much for your support, and finally, Chuck Royce for making this all possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Ren. Our fourth and final speaker for the day is Skyler.
When I speak as a joke, it's like, okay, cool. I'll share my screen. Cool. Yeah, so my name is Skyler Chong. I'm a senior this year, and my project focuses on the restoration of native Hawaiian fish ponds, specifically the recruitment dynamics of a specific invasive species of mullet. So a little more STEMmy, I guess, than some of the other ones, but we'll get into it. A little bit of background on the project. This project was done while I was interning at the Kumuola Marine Science Education Center, which is run through Kamehameha School, the private school in Hawaii. And they manage the restoration of 3 fish ponds located in Hilo, Hawaii, which is also where I am from. And a little more like that, I'm from Hilo, I was born and raised there. My family's been there for generations, but I'm not native Hawaiian myself, and so I view my role in this work very much as one of support. And because of that, I sort of approached this project by talking with my mentors and asking them basically like, what do you need? What questions do you have? What can I do with my time and energy that would be beneficial towards you? So that was sort of the genesis of this project. I'll get into the project itself, but before that, I think I need to give you a little more background on what these fish ponds are, because I'm assuming most of you haven't heard of them before. So just to start off, fish pond in native Hawaiian or Lower Hawaii is local Ia, local meaning pond, Ia meaning fish, and that's sort of the peak. The peak of these fish ponds, they were found all across Hawaii on all islands. And capable of producing 300 to 500 pounds per acre per year of fish, which is a sizable amount of food. That was before the arrival of Westerners in Hawaii, and then with the colonization of Hawaii, the correction of its people and its culture, a lot of these spaces went unmanaged for a long time, the state of disrepair, and were unused, and now are often unusable today for the local Ia. Fast forward to the Hawaiian Renaissance, which is what we call it today. Is sort of this era starting in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where there's a surge of Hawaiian activism. A lot of initiatives were started to revitalize Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian practices such as local Ia. So that's sort of the context of this work. It's really cool. I think it's really inspiring because in working to restore local Ia, you have issues of cultural revitalization and education. You have it hits on issues of food sovereignty because you're producing food. The goal is to produce food for local communities. And then it's also hitting on issues of land stewardship and conservation. So yeah, I think it's really cool. This work really inspires me. Then also it's important to think about how does local Ia work. There are many different kinds of local Ia. The one that I'm focusing on today, and one of the more common ones is the local kuapa. Kuapa meaning wall, and so the defining feature of this type of local is the wall that extends out into the ocean. It encapsulates a portion of the coast, and throughout Hawaii, a lot of the coastline has these freshwater springs, and so in the ponds there are these springs that produces fresh water, which then mixes with the salt water and creates a brackish water environment. And a lot of the fish species in Hawaii are adapted to this water, so they're attracted to it. They inhabit these ecosystems, and so they want to get into the pond. And they do so through these things called makaha, which are sluice gates throughout the wall. You can see that in this diagram. They are made from wood or metal or whatever material, but they have these gaps in them. And the gaps allow for baby fish, juvenile fish, to enter the pond because they're attracted to the water. They grow big, they consume the resources in the pond, meaning algae, but other things as well. They consume all those resources, they get big up to a point where they can no longer escape the pond. So an important thing to note here is that these ponds are naturally stocking. You don't add fish to the ponds manually. They come in on their own accord. So it's sort of this system that takes advantage of a natural ecological process, and it's pretty ingenious in itself. There are many different fish that come into the ponds, but the two that I'm focusing on today are species of mullet. And these are important because of this guy right here, the ama-ama. The ama-ama is the native species of mullet, and it's extremely important within Hawaiian culture. Its references to this fish can be found in place names, in stories, in songs, all of the above. And so it's a very important fish for local i'a. It's also larger in size, getting up to about the length of your arm. And so it's a great source of food as well. On the other hand, you have the conda, which is invasive, smaller in size, and it's generally thought that these two species inhabit the same ecological niche. So they're in the same places, they're eating the same food, and therefore they might be competing with one another. And we have seen rapid decreases in the populations of ama-ama in the past 20 years or so. Another important thing to note about these two species is that the ama-ama spawns once a year. The conda spawns year round. So just in terms of reproductive capabilities, the conda already has a leg up. So it's really important to think about the relationship between these two species because, again, in restoring local i'a, ama-ama is so important to that. You can't have local i'a without the ama-ama. And so if there's an invasive species that is threatening the ama-ama, then it's really important to think about how these two species interact and the different life cycles of each of them. And so my project finally gets back to this question of conda, looking specifically at the invasive species. And in talking with my mentors at Kumuola, what they were really interested in is knowing when the conda are coming into the ponds, when they're recruiting. I use this word recruiting. It's not sort of your typical definition of recruitment, but it's just used to indicate when these fish are entering the ponds. But they wanted to know, their sort of thought process was, we know that the conda spawn year round, but based off of what we can see, we also know that the conda aren't coming in at a constant rate. There are ebbs and flows in their recruitment, and we want to know when exactly are the most conda coming in. And also what are some environmental factors that might be related to that. Because if we can predict when conda are coming in based off of that, then we can sort of potentially create strategies to limit the number of conda coming in. And so to do that, they had started this project in 2018 to take daily counts of the number of conda, both mullet, number of mullet, both conda and ama-ama coming into the pond. Just daily counts. And they use DNA samples because when they're really small, the fish are coming in with babies, really small, you can't tell which species is which. So they took samples to tell when conda are coming in, ama-ama are coming in, and just basically just plotted that out over time. And so what I was doing was basically taking all of this data that they compiled over 3 years and processing it for them to look at the sort of trends in conda recruitment. And what we got was this graph, which shows just overall conda recruitment. And you can see here already, like there are these days where there are huge spikes in recruitment, and then there are also these areas where there's relatively low recruitment or just no recruitment at all. And so to think about this, we wanted to look at conda recruitment in terms of lunar cycle, because we knew that other fish in Hawaii and around the world spawn on a lunar basis. And so we were looking at this area thinking, well, maybe it relates to our moon phases. And we wanted to think about that through the Hawaiian lunar cycle, which has these 30-day cycles, similar to our conception of a month. And each of those 30-day chunks is divided into 10-day phases called Anahulu, which corresponds to the waxing, full, and waning moon phase. So that's Ho'onui, Poipoi, and Ho'emi. And based off of that, you can just see that this graph shows average conda recruitment. And you can see here that Ho'onui and Poipoi, the recruitment during those two phases, so those two 10-day phases, is much higher than that of Ho'emi. So that already tells you something. what I also did was I took it a little further and I went and did some statistics, which is complicated and I won't get into it. But basically I wanted to identify the days in which condo recruitment was significantly high. So significantly higher than the average, basically. So all of this is the same graph from before, but with these vertical lines, which show you when those days occur. And there are sort of three groupings of them, but from this graph, you can't really tell what a pattern might be. So I took those vertical lines and then put them into this graph. And each of those lines corresponds to one of these dots. And it sort of maps them out based on what month they occurred in of the year, and then also what moon phase they were in. And I sort of split the months of the year up into summer and winter just to sort of categorize them. And you can see in this graph that the majority of those significant days of condo recruitment were happening in the summer, and also in Po'onui and Po'epoi, which we saw in that first graph as well. So it's kind of cool. That's the majority of my data, but it, again, in this context of restoring local i'a, which hits on issues of cultural sovereignty, food sovereignty, land stewardship, all of these things where AMA is super important. That's where this research comes in and is understanding and increases our understanding of invasive species that might be threatening the AMA. Yeah, that's my project. I want to say thank you to the folks at Kumoa and the Science Education Center, my mentors, Nalu and Michaelani and Trisha, the folks at the Pacific Interchipic Program for Experiences in Science, I think that's what it was, which is what my internship was run through, and then also the folks at the Soares Center, Maggie and Jesus, as well as Chuck Royce, who funded the Royce Fellowship. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Skyler. So now we'll switch over to Q&A. We'll open the floor to everyone. I want to thank our 4 speakers for their presentations and invite questions that anyone has that are linger. Feel free to type anything into the chat or to just unmute yourself and speak.
I have questions too. I can ask. I can just start us off. Thank you all so much. It's so wonderful to hear about your projects. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how your project changed throughout the course of the fellowship, and sort of how you sort of changed your thinking about it and what that looked like. Let's start.
I can go first.
My projects, I don't know if anyone noticed, the title listed on the pamphlet is different than what this project actually was. And then that title was different from what it was like 3 months ago. So it definitely changed throughout the year, just based on what I thought I was going to be able to do, what I was actually able to do. And then also I continued to work with the people that at Kumoa, as I just talked about. And so the work, I did multiple projects as well. So that's it definitely changed a lot. Yeah.
I can go. I think that my project pivoted a lot based on availability of archives. That's one thing, which I think studying the history of slavery, you have to be sort of malleable and what's available and what is in the records, which is like not specific to my project, but to the field as a whole. And specific to my project, because I'm also doing oral histories with some of the descendants today. I think that it definitely pivoted in that I had to figure out a way to frame like why I'm doing this project and like why this kid who goes to school in Rhode Island like cares about Edenton and think really deeply about why I care both about the project and the people that I'm working with, even when there are like radically different life experiences and also understandings of this history. And I think that's been really rewarding, particularly because a lot of the conversations have really surprised me. I talked to this like 75-year-old man this week who was saying, he was like, I grew up a damn spoiled brat because I have my white privilege. And it was really interesting listening to him sort of like explain his process of understanding that. So I think that letting my project be malleable enough to capture the different experiences of people in a way that I wouldn't have necessarily expected is really important.
Well, I had started with curriculum, and at the beginning of the Royce Fellowship, I had no idea where that would take place, whether it be in a shelter or, you know, in between places, because I started the Royce Fellowship actually doing accompaniment, humanitarian parole accompaniment with migrant families before ending up at the shelter where I ended up pursuing the Royce Fellowship and the curriculum. So I guess my project changed in that I had so much uncertainty. Then I got to the shelter. Then when I got to the shelter, I also needed to have a lot of flexibility because what I had envisioned for the curriculum wasn't necessarily what the children or the families might have needed at the time. So every day there was a big need to just be flexible with whatever the children really wanted to do because they have so much energy. Activities change all the time. There also needed to be flexibility with the conversations I held, which is, I guess, another shift, is that I went back in the winter because I realized I had all these, you know, children's drawings and photographs, but I had no real context as to like daily life and their experiences. So I went back in the winter and had unstructured conversations with family pairs. And it happened that many of the children who were in the summer also continued into the winter. So yeah, that's kind of how my project was shaped, is mostly around community needs. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes. Was there a point in your research where you felt overwhelmed or burnt out? And if so, did you push through it? That's a great question in the chat.
I'm assuming never.
Resilience always. Just kidding.
I guess for me, oh, Connor, you can go first.
You got
I should-
it.
Okay. Well, I remember so we had an extended summer this year. I don't know, we were reflect a little bit back, but we had started like around April or May-ish. And I remember going to office hours with Maggie, feeling really overwhelmed as to where it would be. And I was taking on roles that weren't necessarily related to my research. And so anytime I felt overwhelmed or lost, I'd go to office hours and find my anchor. So that was great. I'd also say, you know, just recently I've also felt a little bit overwhelmed because there's just so much to analyze. But I'm still reaching into like the Royce Fellowship and my advisors and my friends to be able to find that relief and guidance. So yeah, I think that's why the Royce Fellowship, if anyone really is interested in applying next year, that's why it's so amazing, is because you have that community who's going through the similar challenges around the same time. So those guiding meetings during the summer were really great.
I would say for me, there are like two, I think, examples of how I felt very overwhelmed. I think the first is when I went to the archive in North Carolina for the collection that I'm using primarily, and realized that there were probably 40,000 pieces and that it's not humanly possible for me for an undergraduate thesis to read all of it. Especially when I think I underestimated how long it would take to transcribe like 1857 handwriting that's like really faded and in terrible cursive, and to transcribe things before you even know if it's going to be useful. And I think that was really overwhelming, and a way that my advisor talked to me about reframing it was that this is a project that I can come back to, and you can sort of put a pin in things and say, this is a question that I'm really interested in, but I don't really have the capacity to explore in depth right now. So it's something that I can come back to in the future. And second is I hate writing. I hate it. And so I think what's been really helpful for me is finding people to be in community with in writing. So Morgan's here, she's in my writing group. I'm very lucky to have Morgan in my writing group. And so I think that like having community like you have in the Royce cohort is really indispensable in getting through that, because like I know I have horrible writing anxiety, and it's nice to be with people who understand that feeling.
Yeah, I'll
Oh,
what is happening?
you're done.
I'm muted. Oh, I see.
Yes.
No, I
I got
okay.
it.
There we go. It was just instinct to unmute when I was talking.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll second Connor's sort of point on writing. I think for me, it's sort of as a general trend, I think that I have in projects that I've noticed where in the beginning, it's really hard because you have all these thoughts and you want to do it really well and you have all these questions, and then you get started and you're like, how am I actually doing this? And it can be overwhelming, especially like Connor was saying, you find there's so much more work that you could do, and it's overwhelming in that sense. And then in the middle, you sort of get a hold of it. You know what your project is, you're just doing the work. And at the end, it's also overwhelming again, because then you have to synthesize everything, you have to bring it all together and say like, what you actually did. And that process is overwhelming as well. So I think that was sort of the flow of it for me, but it all worked out at the end. Yeah.
I mean, what I'm hearing is, I mean, I think all of you want to do right by the people who are involved in your projects, and you feel like that involves a certain level of care and work that like is just not possible in the like tiny project that you're taking on. And I think that's good that you're grappling with it, but it's also like, yeah, exactly as Connor said, like this is just one instantiation of a much broader commitment that you have. And so I'm kind of curious too, like how do you think about this as sort of part of broader work that you're doing? Part of that could be what's next, but also like, how are you hoping to continue to explore these kinds of questions as you move on from the Royce Fellowship, such as it is?
I guess I could start. So I'm thinking of continuing my research into the summer. So the questions I had put up included looking into like activists, legal, and like news discourse. And so this is also going to transition into like my PhD dissertation and start taking on those roles at those different organizations in San Diego to start tracking and comparing like first person narratives with the discourse that's generated in the local context and then connecting it to the national context. So that's kind of the things I'm thinking about right now.
What PhD? What PhD?
Oh, that's a good question. We don't know yet. But I'm thinking between a migration studies PhD or social anthropology PhD, but I'm favoring the migration studies. I actually hear back on in March, so that's why I can't like, yeah.
I can go. I did it again. I'm sorry.
Natural adult.
I think if you generally took like a poll of people who did the Royce project and other work at Brown too, like most of them would say that they carried on with similar work as the project. Not everyone, but I think when you are working with people and it feels really important, it's hard to like then just like completely switch gears and say and never look back, you know. I personally like the people I was working with and the place I was working in, I absolutely loved it. And so like I have continued to work with them. I like this project that is something I use for my capstone, so I continued to work with them last summer, and then I'm looking to publish the project that I did this semester as well. And so just sort of any opportunity I get basically to continue working with them, I would want to take. And I know that there's like relationships that I built will stay with me for the rest of my life and my career as well. It doesn't end once the Royce project ends.
I think for me, I have no idea what I want to do with my life. So that part is not exactly clear. Maybe ask me in 5 years. But I would say that I definitely am considering the project as something that could be a dissertation if I do decide to do a PhD. And I think that also just knowing that the archive is like, luckily for me, I grew up in North Carolina, so the archive that I'm using is pretty nearby. So like I can just go and like look at the archive if I'm really interested. And then in terms of the relationships, I'm definitely resonating with what everyone else is saying about maintaining these relationships, because I've found it especially, I think, refreshing to chat with people, especially like, for example, there aren't a lot of people from the South at Brown. And I think that it's especially refreshing to talk to people who understand the importance of history and the role of the South in the making of US history. Also, like particularly white people who have an investment in a formation of a history that's more accountable than what we have told in the past. And I think that that's really refreshing. And like, I just enjoy having these conversations with people. And so I'm excited to continue doing that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm hearing is just, the shift from like, I feel like we talk about community engaged research and we know what we mean by that in a lot of ways, but it sounds kind of formalized still. And so we're just talking about like relationships and conversations with people and like these very like things in which it's a part of our lives. And it's not this like, I will go into the community and engage it. It's like, I am in it and this is the work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate all of you kind of framing it in that ways.
Yeah, Ali, do you mind sharing your slide where you have the Windsor definition?
Oh, yeah.
I really love that. It's amazing. And when Skyler was like, it's not gonna be, we're not gonna be able to connect Skyler's work to everybody else's work, but it amazingly really does. Like all of you are writing about knowledge production under racial capitalism and what we're allowed to talk about, what we're not allowed to talk about, what we're allowed to, or what ways of knowing are allowed to exist and not exist. So it was really fascinating to see, like, you talk about the formation of the self, the migrant self, understanding like one's position in terms of relationship to nation states. You're talking about like natural ecologies, indigenous ways of knowing. Connor talking about local histories of racial slavery and what sort of forms an identity for a community, what doesn't. And Ren, who's no longer here, I think, right? Yeah. Talking about science as a way of explaining race or not. There's actually a really interesting conversation between Connor's and Ren's project where you're talking about like trying to understand race in a very particular way and trying to not understand race in a very particular way between the two of yours. But I just love this definition because it talks about like how we fashion knowledge and like what knowledge is acceptable. So I wondered, in like opposition to Ashlyn's question, like was there a moment when like things were going great or like you found joy in research?
In compliment to Ashlyn's question.
Yes, obviously.
Not an antagonistic relationship.
How dare you, Ashlyn? Like a particular interview or a particular,
what was fun,
yeah.
or joyful?
A part of my methodology I didn't cover, but during the conversations I had this past winter, it was parent and child pairs, but my mother also joined me. And so my mother became an anthropologist as well. And I think there were just so many beautiful moments where we were connecting about, mother-daughter relationships and like topics that were important to us. And since we're from the same communities, discussing things was just really nice. And my mom still talks about it all the time. And she also kept a journal. And she wrote poems while people were speaking. So that's going to be integrated in my thesis. So we'll see how that goes.
I think for me, I don't know, my day-to-day was just a really, really fun time. And I think like, because I was interning as well as doing my actual project. And so I don't know, I spoke when I was doing my presentation as well, just of how inspiring the work being done at local EA is and getting to interact with kids as they were coming down to the pond. It's also an educational site as well, so they run educational programs. And interact with kids who are coming back into these spaces and learning about them, and having that as sort of like a foundational learning experience is really cool to see. And then just knowing that that network and that of people and bodies out there was, I don't know, really inspiring for me, and I felt that throughout the entire project.
I don't think there's any part of like the process of my project where like I was like enjoying it, because my project is fundamentally one that's so heartbreaking and violent and destructive, in terms of looking at a past that's, as Sadie Harbin would say, a sort of an abyss. And so I think that for me, it was more moments of recognition of why my project mattered, and also giving me, frankly, hope for the future. And I think that a lot of that did come from having conversations with people in Edenton, conducting oral histories with people who you would assume would have a particular orientation to the past that is completely anti-Black and deeply revisionist, and doesn't really understand the past as it actually happened and its impacts on the present, but people who really surprise you and have a frankly really radical conception of how we can use history to move forward. So like I found out that there's a fairly white like Baptist church in this town that runs a racial reconciliation group that's working on a lot of restorative justice and transformative justice in the local community. And it was really interesting, and I was surprised and excited to see that. And I think a little bit personally, like my grandfather died while I was doing this project, and he was a huge historian and he knew so much about North Carolina history. And I think it was, and he also had a very like orientation to history that was tell the truth as it was and not as we want it to be, even as he was a white man from the South forever. And I think that it was really encouraging to see that there is a sort of strand of people committed to doing the work in the South, especially when they're like being a Brown, there's this very much so an enclave of people who've never really been to the South. Like I'm thinking about Imani Perry's new book called South to America that talks about how the South is really the heartland of the nation. And so I think it's been really refreshing. And those moments of reprieve are really encouraging in the face of so much violence.
Any other questions from folks? Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We'll be here again tomorrow and the rest of the week, noon to 1:30 every day, hearing more brilliant presentations like we heard today. I'm not sure who the GNC are, but for anybody who's interested, the Royce application is open right now. If you're watching this maybe afterwards and you want to apply, the deadline is March 4th. Feel free to reach out to myself, to Maggie, or to any of the fellows that you're seeing here as great examples of what projects can do. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.